Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today is another episode of Contradictory Success Advice. I'm doing a series on my YouTube channel, and it's something called Contradictory Advice. That's usually the title. And that's when we pair two opposing viewpoints of very common success advice. Because when you listen to enough success advice, usually there's contradictory information. And then we try and talk about it, have a discussion about this to figure out, well, are they actually contradictory or which one is right and wrong? In today's episode, we're going to be talking about micromanagement. Now, ever since I got into business and management as topics that I love learning about, usually micromanagement is talked about badly. You're usually told not to micromanage because at that point you're basically not letting the person you hired do the job for you. And you're basically doing the job for the person you hired, which is wasting their salary and your time because you're not letting them do it. And then you have billionaires like Richard Branson say stuff like, the key to my success is to hire incredible people and then get out of their way and let them do their amazing work. So naturally, I thought that micromanagement is a bad thing. It always was. And it was even confirmed by many people who were my age in the workforce that I've talked to who have experienced a manager who was a micromanager and telling me how horrible it was and how essentially they didn't trust you for anything and they had to look over every little thing and almost do it for you and how you should never do it. So I was like, in my head, I was like, micromanagement is always bad. But is it always bad? Because I was reading Bob Iger's biography. Bob is the current CEO of Disney. He's been the CEO for about 10 years now. He wrote a biography recently. It's fantastic. It's called A Ride of a Lifetime. And I finished it and loved it. I highly recommend it. I think he's probably one of the best CEOs of Disney. Don't quote me on that because to really make that conclusion, I would have to look at the numbers, the stock price, the revenues, expenses, and so forth over the years, see how it's returning based on previous performance, the size of the company, and so forth. But generally speaking, just from a qualitative perspective, he's made some fantastic acquisitions, and as long as he didn't pay too much for them, they have paid off very well. And he's been fairly humble as well, admitting in his book that the Marvel acquisition was a huge win, and it exceeded all their projections, and that he didn't credit himself. A lot of it was due to luck. That being said, one part of his book talks about micromanagement, and the previous CEO of Disney, he and Bob had a little bit of a complex relationship, and overall, he always had a wide regard and respect for Michael Eisner, who was Bob's previous CEO. Michael was unfortunately forced out of the board and his seat as CEO at the time that he left the company. But, Bob says that over the decades that he ran the company, it was incredibly successful. And he took it from a company that had lost its luster and was failing and losing money on all of its components to one that expanded to many different areas from just those two areas of film entertainment and theme parks to a much larger global presence with VHS tapes and all these other things. And so basically, Bob's saying that this guy was an incredible success and contribution to Disney as a company, turning it from a failing enterprise into a successful enterprise before it was handed off to Bob himself. And so he has a very high regard for this person, at least from his biography. And so here's the thing, though. He says that Michael was a severe micromanager. He cared about all the tiny little details and would even brag about it to reporters. He would take someone into one of the Disney resorts, those fancy resorts that cost a $1 jillion a night, and he would point out some tiny little detail, maybe the carpentry or like how the curtains hang or some little design, and he'll tell the reporter, I did that. And so, long story short, well, what's the answer here? Michael, as detailed in a book, was a severe micromanager. Not, I wouldn't say super severe, but like he looked at every single detail. He went over those details with his employees. He checked every tiny thing, and if it wasn't right, he made them change. Yet other people are saying that micromanagement is bad. So which one is it? And I think the answer is that micromanagement is, generally speaking, bad. But the details, the tiny little details, are very important for a good customer experience. So you have to get those right. And that doesn't necessarily mean micromanaging in the way that Michael did. It could just mean delegating to people that you know and trust, who always deliver, to make sure the details are right. Apple is a great example of a company that gets all the tiny details of their design right. And does its CEO, Tim Cook, drill down to the lowest department and check every tiny detail and hammer it home and nail them if they get it wrong? Maybe not directly. Maybe he'll look at the product afterwards, and if he sees something wrong, he'll check with the appropriate team leads. But you want to make the experience of those tiny details something that gets fulfilled, but isn't fulfilled in a way where you are bottlenecking and choking the entire organization because it has to go through your approval and your screening and so forth. It reminds me of Sam Walton, one of the richest people to ever live. When he created Walmart, one of the top companies, most highest profit generating companies of all time. And in his biography, Made in America, he has these profiles of his top employees, his managers, describing moments during Walmart's ascent to greatness. And one part of it was when they described how Sam managed his employees. And how Sam did it was he would always check. He would always look over your shoulder. Not because he didn't believe you or trust you, but just because he needed to check to make sure everything was done right. And it was a style where he cared about the details, but he didn't restrict people. He simply did that over the shoulder check to make sure everything was in line and so forth. But he still let you get through your work and let you do it. He didn't sit there with you and constrict you and make all your moves for you, or just show dramatic levels of poor trust in you. And so I think that's the compromise or resolution to this seemingly contrasting viewpoints. Now, in Bob's biography, he describes Michael as this excellent CEO, which unfortunately led to, bigger problems as he bid for CEO to replace him. But even then, he had a high regard for Michael after he was ousted out. And when he described Michael and his micromanagement, it was still in a way where he thought that he agreed for the most part. He said that the details, the tiniest details, are super important. They do make an impact for the guests. But on the flip side, the one thing he disagreed with Michael on was that although a certain level of micromanagement is useful, you shouldn't let it constrict you and constrict your employees to a harsh degree. And more importantly, you shouldn't let it be something that becomes the forefront of a public-facing enterprise. So he disapproved of when Michael would brag about this to reporters or the press, and he thought that it made him look worse rather than better. So just food for thought. I'm not saying my opinion is the definitive right opinion, but I did bring up some useful, relevant case studies from successful people and try to pinpoint it all together to bring about my point, my conclusion. And let's have a discussion. Let's keep our minds open. Even myself, maybe I am wrong. Maybe micromanagement is good. But for now, that's how I see things. And I just find the whole thing very fascinating.